We've all seen movies that, despite they mostly received praise, we simply didn't get into that much. Since I've made a top 10 movies I enjoy that received mixed reactions video already, I thought it would be fun to make an opposite list as well. Keep in mind, this list is entirely opinion-based. I'm not saying you're wrong for liking these movies, or that I'm better than you for thinking less of these films. Also, I've made a couple of rules for this list. Only movies I've seen in recent years, so they're still fresh in my memory, and only movies that I've watched from start to end without anything interrupting the experience. Oh, and no movies that I already talked about on my channel, even though some would end up high on this list. Let's not waste any more time and start that list. Number 10. Cabin in the Woods. The Cabin in the Woods is a satire horror movie. It purposefully shows the same cliches many other horror movies do in order to make fun of them. But because it follows these cliches so closely, it ends up doing the same things wrong other cliché horror movies do. You still have the same bland stereotypes, and it follows a cliché narrative tons of other horror movies have done before. The only real difference being that it happens in a different context. I won't spoil what's actually going on in case you still want to watch the movie, but I thought the trailer and opening made it clear enough so it didn't come as a surprise when they made the reveal. While there is originality in the concept, I don't think they made enough use of the potential of this concept. As a result, I was mostly bored by this movie. There were a couple of chuckles here and there, and the idea around the cliches is original, but I didn't think it offered enough spice to make the overused tropes funny again. I don't hate it, but don't enjoy it either. Number 9. Labyrinth. Visually, this is a stunning movie. The puppetry is very impressive, and I like how this world is a bit darker, but still manages to remain sort of feel-good compared to modern fantasy worlds. I think David Bowie is an amazing artist. Both his songs and his performance are easily the most entertaining parts of the movie. But what I didn't like was everything else. Literally everything else. The story is quite bare-boned, and the narrative that is there is completely nonsensical. It's an Alice in Wonderland-styled fantasy story about a girl that travels through a fantasy land and stumbles upon all kinds of strange creatures. It's a movie that is so devoid of any kind of logic that it came across as more random than creative. It felt like the creators were sitting around a table, thinking of strange monster designs to make puppets of, and decided to make a movie out of whatever random sketches they drew. The story they drew up to connect these random monster designs felt like it was made up on the spot, due to its cliches and lack of character progress. In terms of development of the main character, the way she interacts with the creatures, the spoken dialogues, there just wasn't anything to her, and I got really darn bored by this movie. Personally, I like it more when there's a sense of logic to connect things in the fantasy world, which creates more weight behind the events because you know things can have severe consequences. In movies like Spirited Away or Return to Oz that have similar concepts, the main characters actually grow within the story and there are consequences to their actions. I ended up enjoying those films a whole lot more, but with Labyrinth it felt too random and too cliché to really get into, despite its clever looks, good Bowie songs, and some fun monster ideas. Number 8. The Hunger Games. What bothered me the most about this movie is that it didn't agree with how serious it handles its own story. It's like it's an inevitable future we're barreling towards, rather than an interesting what-if scenario. In case you're not familiar with the story, The Hunger Games is about a group of young people from different poor districts who are forced to fight each other to death on a yearly basis to remind everyone of a war from the past. That is like if we forced grandchildren of World War II survivors to fight each other so we don't forget that World War II happened? Which is a ridiculous idea. I heard that in the sequels it turns out this is just a cover-up, and there's actually a much more complex, better developed reason for the Hunger Games to happen. But I haven't seen the sequels, so I can't say whether the motivations are better justified in those movies. However, it doesn't change the fact that this movie does everything in its power to convince you this is the reasoning behind it all. Literally, from the opening of the movie, they tell you it's to remind people of a war, and from there on out, a large portion of this movie is about moments that dive into the reasoning, rather than watching the Hunger Games itself. I mean, if the basic setup of a movie doesn't work, it gets very hard to be invested in the consequences. How to do it right, though, is how Battle Royale treats its subjects. That movie barely gives any explanation of the motivation. Instead, it's entirely focused on the fight on the island and how it affects the characters, which I think works much better since you don't feel the need to question the logic, because they don't seem to question the logic. But aside from the concept, the main character is a one-dimensional character that seems to agree on every morally good choice without a second thought, which makes her a rather bland protagonist. I heard that's actually loyal to the book, since in the book she also acts this way, but there you can read about her inner thoughts that explain why she makes these particular decisions. Adaptation-wise, it's very loyal, but it doesn't translate that well to a visual medium. That, and I honestly thought the people she had to find are rather dumb. They have multiple chances to kill her, but there's always something forcefully written into the plot to hold them back. Maybe if I were to read the books or watch the sequels, I'll get more into it, but as a standalone movie without being familiar with its plot, The Hunger Games didn't do it for me. Number 7. The Babadook. The Babadook is a psychological horror movie about a single mother dealing with grief over the death of her husband. As she deals with that, she's confronted by a monster called the Babadook, who is a metaphor for her grief-induced depression. This premise is what makes the Babadook a unique horror movie that received praise for its artistic approach, but in my opinion, this is exactly the reason why this movie doesn't work. Because everything related to the monster is just a metaphor. There was never an actual threat. Why should I be scared of a monster in the hallway if I know there's not really any monster? A large section of this movie consists of suspenseful scenes where strange things happen, trying to make you scared of a possible confrontation with the monster, but there was no real threat because there is no monster. And it didn't lend a deeper insight into the process of depression or grief either, because everything is told like it's about a monster confrontation. By trying to be both, it ended up being neither, at least to me. And in all honesty, couldn't they have made her son a little less unbearably annoying? The positives are that I really like the book itself. It's a Tim Burton-styled creepy story that looks really cool. There's a YouTube video of someone who reads the book as he shows the images, and I highly recommend checking it out if you're interested. The acting is very impressive, and at least the movie tries something new, rather than being the millionth cliché slasher movie. There were no cheap jump scares or overused clichés, which is worth complimenting. I didn't enjoy it, but there's more quality to it than most horror movies I don't like. Number 6. James and the Giant Peach. Visually, this movie is absolutely gorgeous. Stop motion at its finest. The designs, movements, lightings, colors, and the sets. Everything is dripping with life, which makes it a very pleasant movie to look at. But what rubbed me the wrong way is its plot. The story is about a kid losing his parents, so he's forced to live with his mean aunts. There, he stumbles upon a magical giant peach with fantasy creatures living inside of it, and they make the decision to travel to New York together. This could be a harmless fantasy story about dealing with grief and putting positive spins on things and staying strong. But the story is rather poorly developed, making it more despicable than charming. His parents get killed by a giant monster rhino that literally shows up out of nowhere in the opening of the movie. Where did the rhino come from? Why did he want his parents dead? Why didn't he attack the kid? Why doesn't he come back? It's almost comical how strange and out of nowhere this plot element is. But then again, it's about dealing with losing your parents at a young age, which is a very serious subject. The fact that this movie treats it so strange is more poor taste than anything else. Similar to Labyrinth, they stumble upon all kinds of random things without any logic to connect them, making it come across more random than creative. Randy Newman wrote the songs for this movie. I like Randy Newman's work for Toy Story and The Princess and the Frog, but here it feels like they picked the worst aspects of his music and solely focused on that. The songs are bland, too simple, sentimental, and rather nonsensical. None of the songs seem to have any real purpose other than being there for the sake of having a song. They got really boring really fast. Every now and then there are some fun moments. I especially like this line.
Spray us? They'll see the yank up there and come after us with a shovel. It happened to my brother.
How awful.
Split him right down the middle. Now I have 2 half-brothers.
As a whole, James and the Giant Peach was visually amazing, but its content was very bland and it's rather gut-wrenching to see how poorly it treats a serious subject. Number 5. Les Misérables. Les Misérables is a 2.5-hour musical where they sing all the way through, never giving you a break. This was just too much singing for too long, and most of the time the songs were forgettable. Some of them were genuinely good, but they were too far apart and I really wish there was more talking in between. But the constant singing isn't even my main issue with the movie. It's the way the story is structured. I don't know the Les Misérables story, and this movie didn't serve as an informative introduction. The story feels way too big for a 2.5-hour movie. As a result, most scenes contain huge jumps in time where they try to develop a character or explain what happened through an exposition-filled song. The story was explained to me, but I never really got to experience it. For example, the story starts with the main character leaving prison, but no one wants to hire him because of his criminal past. Once he finds shelter in a church, there's suddenly a huge jump in time to where he became president. Hello? How did that happen? The one moment he's leaving prison, now he's president? That transformation could have been an entire movie on itself. But the plot element that bothered me most is the love story in the second half of the movie. Two characters that I don't know saw each other walking down the street and suddenly they're madly in love and want to marry each other. This is something I would expect out of an old fairy tale movie aimed at children, but not a modern drama movie aimed at adults. It's extremely bland and forced. Some of the songs are genuinely good and the acting is outstandingly amazing, and I mean Oscar-worthy, jaw-dropping good. But the story was so poorly structured it never managed to grab me. That combined with the non-stop singing and the long duration made Les Misérables a tough sit.
And I'm Javert. Do not forget my name.
Number 4. All Dogs Go to Heaven. I genuinely fucking hate this movie. I'm sorry everyone who has fond memories of this, but I'm gonna be harsh on this movie. It just rubbed me the wrong way like no other kids film has done before. Like other animated movies on this list, this is visually incredibly good. It's directed by John Bluth and his artistic touch is everywhere. In terms of visuals, I have nothing but praise for this film, but it's the main character I just can't stand. This is the most unlikable main character I have ever seen in a kids movie, and he ruins whatever potential the movie has. The story is about Charlie, a criminal dog who stumbles upon a young child that can talk to all animals. She's held hostage by an evil dog that uses her to gain information from horses, so he can use this information to win money at horse races. Charlie decides to free the girl, and I say free with big quotation marks, only to keep her hostage himself. In other words, the main character of a kids movie kidnaps an orphan girl who already was being held hostage, tricking her into thinking he's going to help her only to further imprison her. In fact, he psychologically manipulates her into wanting to be his hostage. She's convinced she's doing good for him, while she doesn't realize Charlie's actually a villain imprisoning her. Even when the girl has found a couple who make her happy and want to adopt her, Charlie manipulates her into leaving them in order to work for him again. I just wanted to punch this asshole in the face at that moment. This is just such a despicable story with such an unlikable protagonist. I hated watching it to no end. I'm not just saying this from the perspective of a young adult. Even as a kid, I felt bad for the young girl and wanted Charlie to leave her alone. In any other movie, Charlie would have been the villain. He behaves eerily similar to Frollo, Lady Tremaine, and Mother Gothel, who actually are villains in other movies. The only difference is that Charlie has a change of heart at the end of the story, but it was too little and too late. Before his change of heart, there was not a single moment of regret or sympathy towards holding this girl hostage. It felt more like a sudden 180 turn than a natural progression. How would you like it if Mother Gothel would have a sudden change of heart in the climax of Tangled? Would you really be happy for her and forgive her for what she has done, or would it feel like a strange, unlogical turn of events? The movie says all dogs are allowed to go to heaven, even though the main character does stuff like this, as well as they clearly show other dogs are capable of murder and other sins. Why are beings who do this awful stuff allowed a free pass? Just because they're dogs? That's bullshit. Thanks, movie. You got me to criticize heaven. I hope you're proud of yourself. Even though I really hate this movie, probably more than any others on the list, the reason it's not higher is because it's visually very good, there were a couple of chuckles, and at least it tries something different. I can see what they're trying to do. Make the main character a villain so you want to see him develop into a good guy due to the father role he gets. Not executed well at all, in my opinion. While I do think the next 3 movies on the list are worse as a whole, some of my most hated parts definitely come from All Dogs Go to Heaven. Number 3. The Polar Express. The Polar Express is a movie I think fails on almost every front. Unlike the previously mentioned animated movies, this one is visually just bad. They tried to make hyper-realistic human characters while the technology wasn't capable of that yet, so the characters look really uncomfortable. Especially whenever there's a close-up, it just looks plain ugly. The environments, however, do look pretty for the most part. Too bad this quality wasn't there for the human characters. But the story also didn't click with me at all. On paper, this sounds like a harmless Christmas story for children, being on a magical train that leads you to the North Pole. But the children in this story act rather off. Look at the main character's reaction upon discovering the magical train that's suddenly in the middle of his street. Nothing. Just a bland stare. That's what he does throughout the majority of the movie. What kid would react like this? If he doesn't seem excited, why should I? Story-wise, nothing that happens in the movie is relevant or anything. Boy jumps on train to meet Santa, he meets Santa, and goes home. Nothing that happens in between is important. There are no real obstacles to overcome for the characters or no interesting developments that feel like the characters made a change. Neither is anything that happens fun or otherwise engaging. For example, there is an entire sequence where he accidentally loses someone's train ticket. So they spend some time looking for the ticket, and after a while they retrieve the ticket, and that's that for this plot element. Nothing happens! And that's just one example. The main character gets an attempt at an arc, namely, he doesn't believe in Santa Claus. Which is an incredibly dumb concept for a story like this. First of all, kid, you're on a magic train that brings you to the North Pole. Upon entering the train, you could have told me the Tooth Fairy was real, and I would have believed you. How much proof do you need? Second of all, why is not believing in Santa presented as a serious issue, like you're watching a religious drama movie, rather than a fun fantasy adventure?
Well, I want to believe. But
you don't want to be bamboozled.
Third, what does believing in Santa Claus add to the grand scheme of things? How does this affect the protagonist at the end? Is his Christmas better now? Is he a happier person overall? What has changed in his everyday life compared to the start of the movie? I like Tom Hanks. He's one of my favorite actors, but even I have to admit that he's not that good at doing multiple voices. It was too obvious he voiced multiple characters, which got really distracting after a while, and it made me wish they hired more voice actors, or someone who's better at doing different voices. The only 2 things I liked about the Polar Express were some of the pretty environments, and the way they build up to the reveal of Santa is pretty clever. He is built up like a big important figure that you don't see often. The way he's always out of view, or the dramatic build-up when you properly see him. It reminded me of when I was a kid and believed in Santa. Besides that, I don't like this movie at all, and it was really hard to sit through.
the night of Christmas Eve, hoping Santa's on his way.
Number 2. Napoleon Dynamite. The most straightforward thing I can say about Napoleon Dynamite is that the movie is 100% aimed at laughs, but I don't think it was funny at all. I remember only one joke in the entire movie that genuinely made me laugh. Aside from jokes, it doesn't have anything else to offer. It consists of a couple of short, unrelated sketches about the awkward life of Napoleon Dynamite. The sketches feel like they were supposed to be for TV, but they decided to slap them together and call it a movie. None of the sketches had real charm to them due to the awkward nature of the characters, and in all honesty, the terrible acting. For example, Napoleon Dynamite stumbles into a guy in school, and from that point they're friends for life. No chemistry, no development, no engaging conversations later in the story. It just kind of happens and you need to roll with it. Watching their conversations is just uncomfortable due to the strange nature of the characters, and I wasn't able to figure out what the jokes were. The rest of the sketches are about things that have been done by other shows or movies too, but they did it a whole lot better, like wanting to become school president or asking someone to the ball. So in the end, there was nothing for me in this movie, and I had a really hard time thinking of anything positive to say about it. However, I did like the opening credits, which is surprisingly creative and fun to watch. I would almost say it's mismatched with the tone of the rest of the movie, but it's worthy of complimenting nonetheless. I also liked certain shots where he stands in front of the lockers because of the artistic composition and use of colors. Besides that, I didn't like the characters of Napoleon Dynamite, his friends, or the entirety of the movie for that matter, at all. Before I get to number 1, some other movies I wasn't fond of but left off the list. Big Hero 6. This movie feels like a cheesy 90s superhero movie that got released in the year 2014 for some reason. It was all too cliched and the characters were too stereotypical for me to truly enjoy, but they were all harmless cliches. There was nothing outstandingly boring or bad, just a plot that is overused, with characters that I've seen too many times before. Where the Wild Things Are. A strange artistic movie about childhood. This movie I thought was mostly strange and I had a hard time figuring out just what I was looking at. It was hard for me to sympathize with this kid because he deals with trouble completely different from mine or any other kid I've met. But I was fascinated with its concept and wanted to figure everything out, so I left it off the list. Everybody Wants Some, Rogue One, Life, and King Arthur, Legend of the Sword. I dislike these movies more than most on this list, but I already talked about these movies in my least favorite movies of 2016 and 2017 videos, so I left them off. If you want to know more about these, I say check the videos out, links are in the description. With all that aside, let's get to number 1. My least favorite popular movie is the animated Hobbit movie. While not as praised as some other movies on this list, The Hobbit received mostly positive reviews. It often has a special place in people's heart for the good memories it gave them, and for how loyally it adapts the famous fantasy novel. But the most honest thing I can say about watching this movie for the first time at a young adult age, and after watching the Peter Jackson trilogy first, is that it's one of the worst animated movies I've ever seen. In fact, it's one of the worst movies I've seen, period. First of all, it's butt ugly looking. The characters look like molten clay figures with very sloppy movements. The character designs have too much detail in them, in the wrong way, which doesn't give them the opportunity to have the solid movements their budget can afford. I think a simpler style would have worked a whole lot better in this case. This bad style is most notable with the overly detailed looking Smaug, where they repeat the same piece of animation multiple times. It became unintentionally funny. The songs are atrocious and they show up every 2 minutes. The voice acting is mediocre at best and the sound editing is awful. Take this scene for example.
Which I intend to call There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Holiday.
Remember how in both the book and in Peter Jackson's adaptation, each dwarf has a unique creative look. Here they all have the same generic design. Remember how terrifying Smaug was described in the book? Here, this is how Bilbo reacts.
Sorry you could not find me, but a fine burglar takes expert catching.
Burglar!
The Hobbit is a good example of why being loyal to the book is not always a good thing when adapting it to a movie. Important sacrifices and changes need to be made in order to make it work as a solid, standalone story, fit for a movie. Here they tried to cram all important events from the book in a 75-minute movie. As a result, the movie runs through the story like a maniac. It feels like none of the scenes have a real start or ending. You jump into an event from the book and then it jumps to the next event without leaving any impact. Nothing is well developed. You don't get to know any character. You don't get to know the world or even get a good sense of story progression. It's one of the most unintentionally funny and immersion-breaking movies I've ever seen. Yes, the Jackson trilogy is often criticized for being too long, and I agree they would have been better off if they were shorter, but this is not how to do it either. Who knows? Maybe we'll get a third Hobbit adaptation somewhere in the future that's actually with a solid length? Every song is a pain to listen to, like they wrote the entire soundtrack in one afternoon. The only scene I think has positive elements in it is the scene with Gollum. This is one of the very few scenes that actually takes its time and does justice to the book. They knew it was one of the most important events in Middle-earth, so they decided to give it the extra flair it deserves. It still suffers from sloppy animation, strange angles, and mediocre voice acting, but the pacing is a lot better. The rest of the film was just pure, unbearable torture to watch, and it ended up being one of my least favorite movies I've ever seen all the way through the end.
Goblins fought and goblins beat, goblins
So, those were my top 10 popular movies I didn't enjoy. Are there some famous movies you're not fond of? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching.